In our hymnal, there is a reading by George Odell that includes the words, "We need one another. All our lives we are in need, and others are in need of us." All humans, all of us, need friendship and support. Scientists have confirmed this to be true, which I find to be ironic. I've met some of these scientists, and I bet a few of them are in a complete panic right now because their research has proven that they need to socialize with one another. Thank you. Even if you aren't a neuroscientist, you probably know that when things get really rough, it helps to have trusted people standing by us. This need for others exists not only when we get into trouble. We need people to help us learn, grow, find meaning, celebrate, and feel encouraged, challenged, and loved. For all these things, we need one another. But trusting people can be risky. We're all humans, which means that we are inevitably going to disappoint one another. There isn't a single person in this room who hasn't disappointed someone or been disappointed by someone, including me. I've disappointed plenty of people. And when people close to us let us down, people we trust, it can be unbearably painful. How do we learn to trust? And how do we relearn it after we've felt betrayed? Social scientist Cynthia Wall, who's a clinical social worker and author, says, "No one is born knowing how to trust. Babies come into a frightening, unfamiliar world, all sensation and no control. Ideally, the first thing they learn is that crying produces a comforting response that they can trust." Wall goes on to say, "Life gives us many teachers, some caring and others cruel. Few people receive a solid base of trust as children, few, and even fewer are taught how to trust themselves." I've had teachers who taught me lessons about trust, some positive and others very negative. Parents, siblings, school friends, teachers, even strangers taught me these lessons. We start by learning that we can or cannot trust our families for safety or love. As we get older, the trust lessons become more abstract. We trust those who tell us the truth, who are kind, who keep their promises, who are honest and consistent with us. We trust those whose actions are predictable. We also learn who not to trust. We learn not to trust those who disappoint us, deceive us, abuse us. We learn that it can be risky to trust. We get hurt. We learn that relationships are fragile. People can leave us or take advantage of us. The first time this happens, it can be devastating. We may feel as if our whole world is on the verge of collapse. As children, we also can learn to trust ourselves. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote these words, "Trust your instinct to the end, though you can render no reason." Emerson is talking about what I would call the gut check. Sometimes everything about a situation checks out rationally, but a gut check reveals that you don't feel quite right about it. Sometimes we can't even articulate what's wrong. Learning to trust yourself, including that gut check, is another important lesson. Because people who don't trust themselves are often too trusting of others or unable to trust anyone. So how can we figure out who to trust? Ernest Hemingway once said, "The best way to find out if you can trust somebody is to trust them." We learn to trust by practicing. Through trial and error, we learn to trust by trusting. For me, trust is an embodiment of my theology. I'm not one of those people who trust that everything works out for the best. I know that some of you have experienced that as truth, but I haven't. But I do have a deep conviction that despite betrayal and disappointment, being alive is good, love is always a possible option, and despite my imperfections, I belong here and I matter just like everyone else. I try to practice trust in others and in myself. Sometimes I'm wrong. I also try not to take that personally. Trusting people is a part of affirming their inherent worth and dignity. In this community, trusting each other means that even when we disagree, we all assume that we want the best possible outcome. Parker Palmer is a Quaker writer who often leads us deeper into conversations about trust and courage. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, he writes that some journeys are direct and some journeys are circuitous, some are heroic and some are fearful and muddled. But every journey, honestly undertaken, stands a chance of taking us where we belong. Palmer is referring to the gamble we make when we trust. For good or for ill, he encourages us to make that gamble, to reach out to others and to potential opportunities in life, even when we're not sure, even when we're completely unsure, because the only way to become sure is to try. William Arthur Ward addresses this in his poem called To Risk. To laugh is to risk appearing a fool. To weep is to risk appearing sentimental. To reach out to each other is to risk involvement. To expose feelings is to risk exposing your true self. To place your ideas and dreams before a crowd is to risk their loss. To love is to risk not being loved in return. To live is to risk dying. To hope is to risk despair. To try is to risk failure. But risks must be taken because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. The greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. But risking, trusting, well, it makes me nervous. It makes us vulnerable. But it turns out that vulnerability is the key to connecting meaningfully with others. Brene Brown, whose work Ashley just quoted, is the author of a book called Daring Greatly: How the Courage to Be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live. Brown became very interested in people that she called wholehearted. And by this she means people who she characterizes as courageous, compassionate, and most importantly, connected. She found out when she looked at these people that they all shared one common trait, and that was vulnerability, the willingness to be vulnerable. She writes, the willingness to be vulnerable emerged as the single clearest value shared by all the women and men who I described as wholehearted. They attribute everything from their professional success to their marriages to their proudest parenting moments to their ability to be vulnerable. In the stories of her subjects, Brown discovered that our ability to accept and embrace our vulnerability is a quality that is essential if we want to maintain and create meaningful and trusted connections with others. Now, this was not something that I particularly wanted to hear, and Brown initially wasn't so thrilled by it either. Who wants to be vulnerable? Isn't that just inviting someone to hurt us? I can certainly remember a time when I regretted opening up to someone, and I bet a lot of you can too. Brown understands this. She writes, our rejection of vulnerability often stems from our associating it with emotions like fear, shame, grief, sadness, and disappointment. What most of us fail to understand, and what took me a decade of my research to learn, is that vulnerability is also the cradle of the emotions and experience we crave. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope and authenticity. So my first reaction to reading that paragraph was to disagree strongly. Vulnerability, look at the definition. The quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed. Who wants to sign up for that? According to Brown, vulnerability is necessary, as scary as it is, for creating the close connections that we want as human beings, but she acknowledges that it feels very risky. In the book, I love this chapter. She devotes an entire chapter to the habits that we develop just to avoid being vulnerable. So one of the habits she mentions is practicing what she calls foreboding joy, which basically means that in the midst of experiencing something joyful and fulfilling, we're already thinking about the things that can go wrong. Did anybody do this? I do it. Yeah. Another way of resisting vulnerability is to practice numbing. Numbing can take the form of an addiction, a compulsive behavior, a video game, or anything that we use consistently to distract ourselves from connecting with others. Drinking, binging, isolating, shopping. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. A third way of resisting vulnerability is perfectionism. Perfectionism isn't the same thing as trying to do your best. It is insisting on having control over every variable before you're willing to open yourself up. It's an attempt to move all elements of risk from relationships. Good luck with that. Reading about these strategies made me feel, vulnerable. I practice all three of these types of resistance: foreboding joy, numbing, and perfectionism, but especially perfectionism. Perfectionism is a very common trap in ministry. As a minister, I'm supposed to know stuff, right? For example, I think I should know what's written in the worship committee charter, but I don't know because I can't even find it on my computer, and I can't open it until Andrew or David tells me how to. And a voice in my head says, seriously? What kind of minister are you anyway? Shouldn't you just know what the worship committee charter says? What's going to happen when someone asks you a real question, like, why am I suffering so much? Or, what does my life mean? And of course, the voice in my head goes on to warn me that my answer to those difficult questions must be wise and witty, profound, original, eloquent, and delivered with absolute confidence. No problem. But Brené Brown would not agree. She would say that even if I could come up with some confident answers, it would be much better to answer honestly from a place of vulnerability. This would mean simply admitting that I don't have all the answers, that I struggle with those same questions, and often life is a complete mystery to me. Other ministers may feel confident delivering the one right answer from God's mouth, but Brown would say that confidently delivering correct answers does not foster the kind of connections that are formed when we wrestle with questions together. The vulnerable, wholehearted people that Brown describes have absolute trust in two things. The first has to do with unconditional love. They trust that they are worthy of unconditional love, even though they may not experience it very often. And the second thing they trust is that their flaws and foibles make them unique and beautiful. It should be a great relief to us that this is true. Think back to some of the most meaningful memorial services you've ever been to. What do you remember? Was it meaningful to hear how perfect the dearly departed one was? Did you weep when you heard they paid their bills on time? Or kept a perfect house? No, we want to hear the funny stories, the goofy things they did, the times they showed up at a party in an outrageous costume when it wasn't actually a costume party. We love people for who they are, for not how flawlessly they live. Wholehearted people trust in their own lovability and the worth of their individuality. They are able to let go of messages about who they should be and embrace instead the fullness of who they are. And somehow they hang on to this mindset even when they're hurt and victimized or disrespected. They trust in love, that love and goodness allows them, that trust in love and goodness allows them to connect powerfully with others and makes them incredibly resilient to the ups and downs of life. As poet Rabindranath Tagore writes, trust love, even if it brings you sorrow. Do not close up your heart. I want to take a minute before I wrap up and acknowledge something important, something that I began to understand between the first time I preached this sermon a few years ago and now. Brene Brown is a white woman, as am I, and it occurred to me that a state of vulnerability means something very different to me than it does to a person of color in our white supremacist culture. The consequences of vulnerability could be very, very different for me versus, say, my tall biracial teenage nephew who sports a fabulous afro. I know nothing about that kind of vulnerability. And I certainly wouldn't presume to give him advice about how vulnerable he should be in the world. He lives with different risks, as do many other people who do not identify as members of a dominant culture. And so I just want you to keep that in mind. Our seventh principle affirms that we exist in a state of connection, each inextricably bound to all. Our place in the web of all existence is ideally a place of connection, of belonging, and of love. It's not easy to trust in that love. We get so caught up in our lives and fears and distractions and old habits that often love is the last thing on our mind. But love is the only way. Nerve-wracking, heart-pounding, frustrating, unfair love. The kind of love that reaches out first. The kind of love that forgives or offers compassion even when we're hurt and angry. The kind that frightens us because it takes us out of our comfort zone, and that makes us feel so vulnerable. But that vulnerability is exactly the key to living deeply trusting, loving lives. Here in this community, we hope to create an opening for people to practice living wholeheartedly, examining our fears in the face of life. Here in this community, we try to make room for risk, create space for grace, and allow trust to grow. So as you are willing and able, take the risk. Reach out in trust. Practice the love. Remember, we need one another. Amen.